Traveler. Hi. Yeah, Fleshme's here to interrupt your video. I won't take long. I'm just here to say I have been doing a lot of Twitch streams recently. I should be doing a stream the day that this is posted. Maybe if I'm not, I'll post a pinned comment about it. But here's a link. If you want more meese, go follow that channel. I'd be live streaming. Okay, you guys can go back to your video now. Hello. Snezhnaya is almost here. In just under 4 weeks, we're going to be getting Genshin Impact 7.0, and after being deprived of one for an entire year, we are finally getting another Traveler variant. And just like all the ones before him, except for Hydro Traveler, this new Traveler is going to be his best iteration yet. Cryo Traveler is looking to be an extremely relevant unit, and he's likely to maintain a decent amount of relevance throughout Snezhnaya, which is just wonderful news for a free unit. He's not just good by my standards, he's actually looking like a relevant option in a lot of top teams in the upcoming patch. So let's talk about what the freak this little guy does. First off, to clear the air, yes, Cryo Traveler does enable both of the upcoming stellar reactions, albeit with a little bit of a caveat. His ability to enable 2 different reactions isn't actually unique to him. In the upcoming patch, once Stellar Swirl releases, it's also going to be added into Sandrone's kit, and the upcoming off-field stellar unit in Odette also enables both of the stellar reactions. Cryo Travelers is just a little bit weaker. Sandrone and Odette are both going to enable both reactions and give them base damage up to 14%, just like all the lunar units that only enable one special reaction. But Cryo Traveler is following in Columbina's footsteps, only getting a 7% base damage buff to all of these new reactions. He still has the exact same cap to his buff, being 2000 attack. This does make him slightly weaker than these limited characters, as you'll be dealing a little bit less stellar damage across the board, but frankly, I don't really care. It doesn't matter that much. I'm just happy he enables the reactions in the first place. He can get a nerfed version of the passive. Now that the reactions actually have some sort of reasonable impact, and we are getting buffed characters who rely on other units to enable the reactions for them, it's much more important that he just enables the reactions in the first place. Anyways, let's move on to talking about his actual kit, because it's kind of weird. Cryo Traveler's normals are the same as ever. They have the exact same scalings, but we'll get into them a little bit later because this Traveler, just like Pyro Traveler, has a playstyle in which they will be on-fielded. Moving to this skill, it's a pretty simple ability, deals a little bit of cryo damage, summons a Frost Pierce Star, which by default just acts as off-field cryo application. While this version of Cryo Traveler is built around stellar reactions and is intended to be used with other stellar units, they can still be used as a generic cryo off-fielder. They're not a particularly good one, but they are a free one. They do have a few buffs in their kit, but they don't lend themselves to a regular cryo playstyle. But by default, they do at least apply cryo off-field with an ability that has a 15-second cooldown and a 12-second duration. Not too terrible uptime. What is terrible is the damage. Right here, we're looking at talent level 10 multipliers. We could even be nice to them and bring it up to level 13 because of their extra constellations. The initial cast is still under 200% scaling, and your ice crystals, which is the overtime damage, is less than 50. These numbers are pretty miserable, and even though Cryo Traveler can be geared to do a decent amount of damage, that damage is not going to be coming from this skill. In any case, the base version automatically periodically fires ice crystals at nearby opponents, applying cryo, but this skill actually has a secondary form. If the Traveler is in Radiant Stellar Conduct, so if you trigger a Stellar Conduct, the Frostpierce Star will no longer fire ice crystals at set intervals, but will instead fire ice crystals when the Traveler specifically hits with a normal charged or plunging attack. This means that in Stellar Conduct, Cryo Traveler can no longer be used as an off-fielder. My opinion is a little bit split on this, because while I do think it's interesting to give Traveler different kits based on what reactions are triggered in the team, this does make it so that Cryo Traveler is not a functional off-fielder for your newly buffed stellar units, or any Stellar Conduct on-fielders for that matter. And while he does at least enable the reaction for Cyno and Wriothesley, if you play him in their teams, he will end up being a dead slot, basically how Sandrone is this patch. If you want a Stellar Conduct off-fielder, you will have to pull Odette next patch, although there might be more options for Stellar Conduct off-fielders down the road. So basic overview of the skill is it does off-field cryo application, unless you are in Stellar Conduct, in which case it turns into coordinated attacks specifically for the Traveler, and overall the skill doesn't do very much damage. However, that's not the final effect, as we can also see. When an opponent is hit with an ice crystal, the Traveler gains 1 stack of Frost Glow, maximum of 8 stacks, and we will get into talking about what Frost Glow does by talking about the burst. And it's relatively simple. It's pretty much just a 60 cost burst that deals cryo damage. The burst hits multiple times, and Frost Glow increases the damage that each hit of the burst deals, and when you have 8 stacks, you also get more hits overall. The base amount of hits is 3, with 8 stacks of Frost Glow, you get 2 more for a total of 5. Additionally, the damage of this burst will convert to either Stellar Conduct or Stellar Swirl damage based on which reaction was triggered the most recently, which again has all of the implications that direct reaction damage often does. It ignores defense, it has a bunch of bonuses from specialized gear, it no longer scales on damage bonus and instead EM, yada yada. In any case, this burst, if converted to stellar damage and cast with full stacks, becomes an incredibly significant source of burst damage. Building up maximum Frost Glow is pretty trivial with how often his stars hit, so it will be incredibly easy to get this burst hitting for very high numbers. And that's kind of it for the base kit. Relatively simple. The only complicated thing is that Traveler does not have an off-field presence in Stellar Conduct teams. So let's get on to the Ascension passives. A1 provides a cryo infusion to Traveler when their skill is active while they are in Stellar Conduct, giving them even more of an on-field presence. This is also pretty impactful to the mechanic of Stellar Conduct, where it wants you to be hitting with elemental attacks very frequently to build up stacks that increase the base damage of Stellar Conduct. Although notably right now, those stacks actually don't apply to Cryo Traveler's burst, although I think that's a mistake. I think that's something that's going to be fixed, but just in case that it's not, I feel like I should mention it. But yeah, when they're in Stellar Conduct, so when they're in their on-field playstyle, they get a cryo infusion, and they also get an additional 80% scaling on all of their infused attacks. That is a pretty significant amount of scaling, nearly doubling the first 2 hits of their normal attack string, and still providing a sizable boost for all of the larger hits of their string. Although considering this infusion only activates in Radiant's Stellar Conduct, that means that they're not going to be building for very much regular cryo damage, and these normal attacks still are not going to make up a massive portion of their personal damage. However, as we'll get into, their normals are still an important talent to level. And then his second passive talent is the Flynn's Special. Traveler gets 8% of their attack as Elemental Mastery, capping at 160. Gives them some stats that they like for building stats that they already want to be building. It has a 2000 attack cap. Yippee, free stats. Traveler actually gets a lot of free stats this upcoming version. And of course, their third passive talent is the one that enables stellar reactions. Although they do have another passive talent that is not listed here, which is the Cryo Traveler's variant of this passive. The one where all the Travelers get their own form of a unique infused charge attack. Their charge attack mechanic is fairly simple. They gain stacks when any nearby party member, including themselves, deal any variant of stellar damage, either Stellar Conduct or Stellar Swirl, and just like their burst, this cryo charge attack will change what type of damage it deals based on which reaction you are triggering. Stellar Swirl teams, it will deal Stellar Swirl damage. Stellar Conduct teams, it deals Stellar Conduct damage. As far as I'm aware, it doesn't get any additional scaling bonuses, unlike all of the other charged attacks, not even the additional 80% that Cryo Traveler gives himself upon getting a cryo infusion in Stellar Conduct. That 80% isn't going to apply to their stellar charge attack, but just like their burst, it's not a big deal because these reactions are direct reaction damage and get a bunch of hidden bonuses. And their stellar charge attack has the same 15-second cooldown as all of their other charged attacks. This special charge attack also grants 2 stacks of Frost Glow, making it a little bit easier to max out your full 8 stacks. So while the additional flat 80% scaling on their normal attacks makes it so that their regular cryo normals are a little bit less important to level, the fact that the stellar charge attack doesn't get any additional bonuses makes their charged attack an actual important multiplier within their kit. Their burst is the more significant portion of damage in their kit, but their charge attack is not a small contribution. And now I get to bring up the very hilarious fun fact in that Lumine is just gonna be a little bit better of a stellar unit than Aether is, because inexplicably, Lumine has a higher charged attack scaling than Aether does. Aether's first hit is 110.5, and his second hit of his charge attack is 120%, whereas comparing to Lumine, her first hit is the same at 110.5, but her second hit is 20% higher when crowned. This is true of all iterations of Travelers, but it hasn't really mattered for the past Travelers because their charge attack is not an extremely significant source of damage. But now that it actually does make up a significant portion of their damage profile, this kind of matters. It's still not the biggest thing in the world. It's still only a 20% multiplier. Even when that multiplier is stellar, that's not particularly large. But Lumine is an objectively better stellar damage dealer than Aether is, and I think that's funny. Overall, very simple kit. Skill does off-field cryo as long as you are not in stellar conduct. Burst does cryo damage that gets converted to stellar damage based on which reaction you've triggered. They get a little cryo infusion in stellar conduct, and their special charge attack gets converted to stellar damage just like their burst. Between their charge attack and their burst, they're going to have a significant damage profile, whether they are used as a stellar swirl off-fielder or as a stellar conduct on-fielder. They still can be used as a quick swap damage dealer in stellar conduct, even though they don't have an off-field presence. But because the kit requires you to hit with the elemental skills stars to gain up frost glow stacks, if you aren't on-fielding Traveler and you aren't building up their frost glow stacks, then their burst damage is going to significantly suffer for it. You really want to be gaining the full 8 stacks before using their burst, and they shouldn't have any trouble getting those stacks as a stellar swirl off-fielder or a stellar conduct on-fielder, but you will have a lot of trouble gaining those stacks if you're trying to use them as a quick swap off-fielder in stellar conduct to enable another stellar conduct carry. Anyways, let's get into constellations. But a quick caveat before I do, a lot of calcs going around are calcing using C6 Cryo Traveler, but we just don't know if C6 Cryo Traveler will be obtainable in 7.0. In fact, I think it's kind of safe to assume that he won't be, given that we've had to wait for the constellations on every other variation of Traveler. I think it's kind of foolish to assume that. I think we can really only assume that we'll be getting 1 or 2 constellations, but to be fair, C1 and C2 are still pretty impactful. C1, Traveler gets 5 energy when they deal any type of stellar damage. This effect can trigger once every 0.5 seconds. Even though both of their abilities that deal stellar damage hit multiple times, that's where this 0.5 second cooldown comes in. The charge attack definitely does not have an entire half second between both of its hits, but the burst having 5 hits might make it so the first and the 5th hit are staggered enough where you can get this effect to proc twice, but I wouldn't bet on it. The safe assumption is to say that this constellation is going to give your Traveler an extra 10 energy every rotation, which reduces their 60 cost burst to a 50 cost burst, which is still not a small amount, although they do get another energy reduction that we're going to go into. C2 is a small buff to EM. The active character gets 60 EM for 5 seconds when an opponent is hit by an ice crystal, and then if that buffed character triggers a stellar reaction or deals stellar glimmer damage, that boost gets doubled from 60 to 120. Of course, this is intended for stellar teams. EM is useful for stellar swirl on-fielders and for the Traveler as a stellar conduct on-fielder, although because it relies on the Traveler's skills application to activate, that means that if you are in stellar conduct, it will not work off-field, just like the rest of their skill, and this does give Cryo Traveler a very slight buff to be used in non-stellar teams. 60 EM is really not all that big, but if you're using Cryo Traveler as a melt enabler for potentially Mawika or Arlecchino, Cryo Traveler can act as a decent lower investment option. C3 is burst levels, that's extra damage. C5 is skill levels, that's basically not extra damage. Personally, I think they should have had a normal attack constellation, but whatever. C4, duration of Frostbeard Star is increased by 25%. Base duration is 12 seconds, extra 25% is 3 more seconds, boosted up to 15 seconds, and that makes Cryo Traveler have a nice and even 100% uptime. 15-second skill duration, 15-second cooldown. Yippee. Fantastic. We don't have to deal with the headache that is Sack Sword on Pyro Traveler. They can rotate fast and they have full uptime. Love to see it. And then we have C6, which makes your Frostglow stacks even more important. Upon using their burst, every stack of Frostglow consumed converts into a 5% stellar damage bonus for the full party. 8 stacks, maxes out at 40%. Because this is reliant on having Frost Glow stacks, you're going to have the same issues with using Cryo Traveler as a Stellar Conduct off-fielder. They're not going to be able to max out their Frost Glow stacks to make their burst do a significant amount of damage. They're not going to be able to access this buff in C2. They're not going to be able to maximize their Frost Glow stacks for this full party Stellar Glimmer buff. They have heavily restricted access to all of their off-field utility in Stellar Conduct teams. But if you are running them in either of their intended playstyles, they can very easily get all their stacks, and this C6 becomes an extremely significant full party buff. And there we go, that's pretty much it. Cryo Traveler is a fairly simple unit, but they are very good in their simplicity. Their only real weakness is their inability to be used as an off-fielder in Stellar Conduct, which really is annoying. I'm not the biggest fan of Hoyo forcing you to pull a functional off-fielder for your Stellar Conduct units, because the free option they give isn't very compelling. Cryo Traveler still can be somewhat functional in Stellar Conduct teams. They do get some Frost Glow stacks from their charge attack, so they deal a little bit of damage and they do a little bit of buffing, but their efficacy is heavily reduced. Although this actually isn't everything that the Traveler is getting, because while I said that Cryo Traveler does a pretty significant amount of damage with their burst and their stellar charge attack, these multipliers actually aren't very impressive, but they're getting carried by the fact that not just Cryo Traveler, but all of the Travelers are getting a significant amount of free stats next patch. First off is the one that already is inherently in their kit. These buffs that they get from resonating with separate elements, this is what I spent most of my Traveler buff video talking about, because these buffs are pretty meaningful. 10% crit rate, 20% energy recharge, 60 EM, 20% attack, and once we resonate with Cryo, an additional 20% crit damage. Cryo Traveler gets to use every single one of these stats, and all of these free stats stacked on top of each other is a significant increase. They have more crit at a baseline, they have more attack at a baseline, they get more damage bonus from EM, they have to build less energy recharge, and that's not even everything that they're getting. Cryo Traveler is also getting a dedicated signature weapon in the upcoming patch. It's a 5-star sword with a medium base attack, so 608 with a 33% crit rate substat. We will be getting this weapon for free in the upcoming patch, but just like Traveler's Constellations, we don't know how high we can take this weapon. Although frankly, it doesn't need a ton of refines to get particularly crazy, so as long as we can get it up to level 90 and get the base stats, it's going to be a massive improvement. Base effect R1, when Traveler equips this, they will restore 3 elemental energy after hitting an opponent, and their attack is increased by 16% for 8 seconds. This effect has a 5-second cooldown and can be triggered even when off-field. The 16% attack is kind of meh. It does increase with refines and it does really need those refines to get crazy, but 3 energy every 5 seconds that can be triggered off-field is kind of a big deal. Depending on the length of the rotation of the team they're played in, they can trigger this either 3 or 4 times. And 9 to 12 flat elemental energy plus the base stats and the 16% attack from the passive, it's just a lot of good stats. There's nothing really to complain about. Although this weapon does significantly increase in power with just 1 refine. R2 gives a crit damage buff based on every element that the Traveler has resonated with, 6% per for every element. That's a total of 42% crit damage. This is where the weapon really gets crazy. It gives a good chunk of energy and a massive amount of stats, all for free, just for equipping it on the Traveler. R3 then makes the energy effect jump from 3 energy to 5 energy, which is another very significant increase, going from 9 to 12 energy a rotation, all the way up to 15 to 20 energy a rotation. This is a massive reduction on their energy needs, especially when combined with the 20% that they get from resonating with Electro. After R3, the only thing that goes up with further refines is the attack buff, but the final attack buff at R5 is a massive 40%. At max refines, this thing is just nuts. The only real downside is that this passive only has an effect on the Traveler. Historically, Travelers just don't have the best kits, so while this is a bunch of stats, the Travelers are still the Travelers, and they're going to have a little bit of a difficult time putting them to use, but they still are all made significantly better from this weapon. I mean, Pyro Traveler right here is a pretty competent damage dealer that has some energy needs, and this weapon is going to provide them with a massive increase. I guess another downside is that the weapon's passive gives crit rate and not crit damage, making it so that overcapping is a very real risk, especially on our friend Pyro Traveler here. 33% crit rate from the weapon, 10% from resonating with Animo, and if you're running them as an on-fielder, an additional 40% from scroll. That all added together with the base 5% crit rate that every character gets in this game, Traveler is starting at 88% crit rate. You can only get 12% crit rate in your artifact substats before Pyro Traveler starts overcapping. Cryo Traveler gets a lot less crit rate from their artifact sets, but they also are going to have a much easier time using Cryo Resonance, which gives an additional 15% crit rate, again making overcapping on them a very real risk. I guess if you want to run a Hydro Traveler on Maru Chaussee, they'll run a similar risk of overcapping. Although even though they get all of these very significant stat buffs, they still aren't enough to make a unit as bad as Hydro Traveler actually worth using. They will be easier to use for the people who do want to use Hydro Traveler, but if you weren't using Hydro Traveler at all before, these new buffs aren't going to make you want to. All of these new stats, I would say, are obviously most impactful for Cryo Traveler, as they are the best Traveler, dealing the most damage in their respective teams. Then of course, Pyro Traveler is in second place, dealing a significant amount of damage himself in his on-field teams, and being a bit easier to build for his off-field playstyles. And while his off-field skill doesn't do very much damage, it still has some multipliers, I guess. Actually pretty similar to Cryo Traveler's skill numbers. In any case, you are going to be able to squeeze a little bit more damage out of their skill, but mostly their damage will be still within their burst and their normals. I also would like to give a big shout out to Dendro Traveler. Again, Dendro Traveler is a lot less relevant from when he came out because the base Dendro reactions are just less good than they used to be in comparison with all the other stuff that's going on in the game at this point. But I think Dendro Traveler's main issue not making him a very comfortable unit was his absolutely stupid 80 energy cost and the fact that he has no energy refunds within any of his talents or constellations. So I forgot that C1 gives you 3.5 energy on a skill cast, but that's so small, we're all just gonna ignore that, right? So I already brought up Dendro Traveler in my last video because I thought that the additional 20% energy recharge was a pretty significant buff. And now that he has a weapon that gives him a lot of damaging stats and a lot of extra energy, he's going to be even better at his role. He might stand a chance of actually dealing some significant damage and being somewhat easy to build. While Nahida isn't a particularly powerful unit anymore and most of her utility has been overtaken by Lauma, she still does have some use cases, but I think that once this new weapon and these new buffs come through, it'll be pretty easy for anybody without Nahida to simply use Dendro Traveler in her place. He is becoming much easier to build, and he is going to be able to deal a little bit more significant damage. It's still not great damage, but Nahida also doesn't deal great damage anymore, so for the one guy out there who was wondering if he needed to pull Nahida for anything, no. With these upcoming buffs, I think that Dendro Traveler will be a perfectly functional replacement. I think that Electro Traveler is going to be in a pretty similar place to Dendro Traveler in the upcoming patch. Not particularly great or anything like that, but he does have some interesting things and some niche use cases going on in his kit, and giving him a little bit of extra damage, a little bit of extra energy, it just doesn't hurt. He's going to be able to do a few more things at a baseline, just be a little bit more functional in a few more teams. Not a particularly compelling unit. I actually don't think that the same thing can be said about him and Raiden, but he has some cool roles that he can fill, and he's going to become better at those roles by nature of being a little bit easier to build and being able to deal a little bit more damage. Maybe I'll actually give him the respect of leveling his burst past level 7. And then, just like Hydro Traveler, I think Geo Traveler and Anemo Traveler are a little bit less affected. Granted, I think both of them are slightly better units than Hydro Traveler, not really that meaningfully better, but Geo Traveler does have some multipliers in his kit. He's able to deal a little bit of damage. He's going to get a little bit better at that in the upcoming patch. Anemo Traveler doesn't really have that personal damage, but he has some interesting supportive stuff going on in his burst, in its grouping, and its additional res shred. Still not a unit I would consider using very often for very much, but if you like Anemo Traveler and you want to get some additional use out of him, then this extra energy makes that easier. If I had to put in order, I would say Cryo Traveler and Pyro Traveler are at the top, both benefiting a pretty significant amount. Then Dendro and Electro Traveler, who aren't great, but they're good free-to-play options, and they're going to become a lot better at fulfilling those roles. And then Anemo, Geo, and Hydro, who generally you don't really use unless you actually want to be using them. And these buffs will make them better, but not so good as to make them particularly compelling units. As for the sword itself, yes, it is a generic 5-star stat stick that has 5-star stats. It has medium base attack, it has a crit rate sub. Those are nice stats that can be put on anybody, but the fact that it doesn't have any passive makes it a lot worse for a lot of units. The fact that so many units are getting free crit rate from so many sources makes the crit rate sub stat a little bit less useful, and also sword users have a lot of pretty decent free-to-play options, like for example, Finale of the Deep here. It gives an absolute ridiculous amount of attack at R5 if you can meet the healing condition, and that means that for units that can still use an R5 Finale of the Deep, it's gonna be better than the 5-star stat stick that doesn't do anything in the passive. So units like Skirk and Clorand already have pretty powerful alternatives in craftable weapons, and non-attack scaling units that don't care about the high base attack like Tsibai and Chiori already have a free option in Harbinger of Dawn. It can be a little bit tricky to work with the 90% HP passive, but if you can get it to work, then Harbinger absolutely whoops the Traveler's new signature on either of these characters. I'd say probably the most notable recent unit that is going to benefit from this weapon is Durin, but he also has a pretty decent free-to-play stat stick in Moonweaver's Dawn. It's certainly going to be a usable option for accounts that aren't as invested and don't have as many weapon options, but most sword units do have equivalent or better accessible options. So it's mostly a weapon for the Traveler themselves. Anyways, I think that's it. This is a pretty short video. Basically just wanted to talk about Cryo Traveler, what's going on with him, and how all of the Travelers are going to benefit from some pretty significant numbers getting introduced next patch. Thank you to my channel members, Najiro, Rumpaltaz, Mudkip, Beef Potato, Roberto Desu, Big Soup, Buffalo Milk, DB, Bab, TSI Amat, Smooty, Tylee, Juicy Jeepers, Nichita, Andromeda, Starnova, Padevan, Tayday, Anime King, and Mr. The Teams. Thank you guys for supporting me month to month. Always appreciate it. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you learned something. Have a lovely day.